Thank you so much for joining us on a chilly evening. We're just so delighted to have you all here. We have a wonderful program for you and appreciate the time that you spent to come out with us here. I'm Kurt Graham. I'm the president of the Adams Presidential Center, and it's just indeed a great pleasure to welcome you all to a program where we're going to be talking about a very important topic to all of us. So we look forward to that. But before we get to the program and our distinguished guests, I want to recognize a few folks who are here with us. Mayor Koch and Mrs. Koch, Quincy, there's the mayor over there in the corner. Thank you, Mayor Koch, for being here. Many of our APC board members are here, General Dunford, our board chair, and several members who are here. We had a board meeting today, so I thank all of you for being here with us as well. We have Aaron Perkins and Mike Morani from the Quincy Public School leadership team. Grateful to have them. Alex McGay from the Woodward School, the headmaster there, and we also have students from Quincy Public School and from Woodward School here tonight. They'll take part in collecting your questions for us as the evening progresses, so we're grateful to have them here with us. From Quincy Historical, Alex and Ed are here somewhere. Thank you for being here as well. And I also want to thank our friends from the Adams National Park, the folks who run the Adams home at Peacefield. They've got a display up here. They brought some artifacts over, and so it'll be here after the program if you'd like to take a few minutes and look at that. We invite you to linger and enjoy that. Also want to thank, of course, the church for hosting us here. Reverend Rebecca is here, and we appreciate everyone who made it possible for us to be here tonight. There will be crypt tours following the program, so you're welcome to stick around and go down and see where the Adams, all four of our protagonists from the Adams Presidential Center are interred in the basement here. So we're always happy to share that. So I did mention that we'll have some questions from the audience. I think you all were handed a card or something on the way in. Feel free to fill that out, pass them to the inner row, and we have the students who will collect them and bring them to me throughout the program, and we'll try to work as many of your questions in for our distinguished guests as we possibly can. So, speaking of distinguished guests, let me turn to them and invite them to join me on the stage. We have Frederica Baer and Professor Gordon Wood. Go ahead, you can have that center. Well, this is not only a distinguished panel, but a very important group to me to be able to assemble here tonight. Frederica and I have been friends since graduate school. We started graduate school on the same day, and we graduated on the same day. And we studied with no one less than Professor Gordon Wood. So this is a fabulous opportunity for us to be here. By the way, just as a matter of trivia, because I know you've got this question in your mind, we were the last two students to finish with Gordon at Brown before he retired. So this is kind of like a little reunion, a little homecoming. You know, this is a great opportunity for us. Both of these folks are incredibly distinguished. Professor Wood has written Bancroft and Pulitzer Prize-winning books, National Book Award, lectured all over. You know him from a documentary series, from TV interviews, from all of that. Frederica has had a very distinguished career as well. Has written a couple of very good books, including recently a book on the Hessians. We're going to get into that and talk a little bit about the war and the role of the Hessians in that. She's the world's authority on that. She teaches and works in administration now, largely at Penn State at Abington, just outside of Philadelphia. And so anyway, it's wonderful to have them both here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come all this way, all the way up from Providence and all the way over from Philadelphia. So let's just start with kind of an obvious moment that we're in. I mean, we're getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our country. And why should we care?
I think we should care because the Declaration of Independence made us a legal people, legally created the United States, but more than that, I think it infused into our culture our highest aspirations, our most important values: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equality. All men are created equal. What are the most important 5 words in the Declaration, and perhaps the most important 5 words in our whole history. So it's something important. That's why we should celebrate it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you think, Frederica? What does this mean to you?
Yes, I agree. These are the incredibly important words for us, I think, around the world. They have inspired people around the world ever since they were written in 1776. And I also believe that this is an ongoing struggle. We've not realized all of these ideals in every regard, obviously, I think. And celebrating the revolution, celebrating this anniversary offers an opportunity to really remind us what we are about and what our values are and our ideals are and what needs to still, I think, happen to realize them.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. What, you two have spent your lives, your adult lives, your careers thinking about, writing about, reading about the revolution. So obviously this is something that on a daily basis you think about who these people were, what they did, their sacrifices, the results of that. That's probably not true for the average citizen. I don't know that a lot of people wake up in the morning thinking about the revolution and how the values of the revolution apply to their lives. So we have a moment here, and you both figure very prominently in the Ken Burns documentary that has just come out. I know some of you have probably seen some of the episodes. There's a lot of it, so do enjoy that. But talk about that a little bit, about this ability to reach people and get more people than just scholars and others thinking about the meaning of the revolution.
Well, the 18th century, although it seems similar to us, is very different from our world. In fact, I think one of the fascinations of history, or studying of history, is to realize that it's a very different world. There's a wonderful epitaph in a book, The Go-Between, which says that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And I think that's the premise that I like to portray to give to my students so they can fully understand, so you avoid anachronism and misunderstanding the past. It's not like us, it's different. And I think students can appreciate if they go to France or Italy, they don't complain that the Italians are different from us. They just accept that. And I think that's what one should do when you're studying the past. And the 18th century is different, and it requires an active imagination, I think, to recover that difference.
Talk to us a little bit about how it's different. I mean, when you think about trying to relate to John Adams and make him relatable to, say, a young person today, he's a different kind of...
Just the clothes they wear, of course, but more than that, the existence of slavery, for example, that we don't have slavery, they did, and it needs explaining. They had different kinds of attitudes towards religion, different attitudes towards most things than we have. So it requires explaining those differences, and that, I think, is one of the excitements of history, but also one of the problems.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as some of those key differences, Frederica, in terms of then and now?
Yeah, I think, when you look at the 18th century, it is a different world in many regards. The social mores, how people act, obviously also the role of women. There's many examples you can give. I would, at the same time, I would say they're still humans. They're still people. Mm-hmm. They have emotions, and in some ways, I think grappling with the same kind of issues, questions, problems that we are grappling with today. For example, when you think of the American Revolution, or if you've watched the documentary, one theme, of course, is that the Americans were not united in this struggle. Not every American was a revolutionary or a rebel, but what I think you really see is, and I think that it's something we can identify with, how do you choose what side you support? What informs that kind of decision? Do you want to keep your family safe, for example? Is that really your top priority? Do you have particular political convictions or religious beliefs or whatever it is? I think there are these themes that I think we can relate to. Yes, I think we definitely need to use our imagination too, but they're not the different creatures. They are still human beings in this world. They just lived 250 years ago.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, we were talking a little bit before about most Americans, when they think of the Civil War, for example, it's a little more relatable. They can understand, and I think, partly because there was photography. I think that's a big part of it. But I think the Revolution does seem like a much more distant, even though the distance between the two, 7 years. I mean, it's not such a long time. It's a lifetime between them, basically. Yeah. So when does that transition happen where the world just becomes a little more recognizable to us as a 21st century audience?
Well, I mean, you mean the political world? Or
Well, just how it becomes a little more relatable to us, whether politically or otherwise.
Well, I think the 19th century is more relatable than the 18th.
Yeah.
So the closer you get to us, the more relatable.
But I think in the 19th century, I think industrialization, there are certain things that are happening that are just a little bit closer to the way we live our lives, or move around or whatever. I think politically, maybe Andrew Jackson and the politics that are changing during that time is a little bit more relatable to our political landscape and environment today than the 18th century. But I would also say that I think a lot has to do with how we tell our histories and how we remember our past. I think our image of the 18th century and the American Revolution is a romanticized, it's almost a quaint period in American life, and I think that also helps explain why we feel so removed from it.
Mm-hmm. The war was anything but quaint, right?
That's exactly right.
It was one of the most violent wars in our history, maybe the most violent because of the deaths. About 25,000 people died in the war. That's 1% of the population.
Right.
That would be 3.5 million if we got into a war now.
But people don't realize that. I think they don't see that. And in terms of violence, one thing that relates to this, the image of the war is red coats against rebels or something like that, citizen soldiers. Well, we actually have significant battles in the Revolutionary War where everyone fighting is an American. You know what I mean? That there are loyalists or Tory forces or whatever, and so people don't realize that. And again, the image is one of this sort of quaint, peaceful, almost world.
The best estimates, I think, that 20% of the population, of course, remained loyalist. And how many at the end? Maybe 500,000 loyalists, but 80,000 left the country or so, something like that. To go up to Canada or to the West Indies someplace, or Florida, because Florida had been acquired by the British.
I always loved the families that had, one son declare as a loyalist and go to England and wait it out, and one declare as a patriot and stay here just so the estate would be protected one way or the other.
Yeah, that was that kind of calculation took place.
Yeah, absolutely. Frederica, talk a little bit about the war in the sense, with the Burns series. I mean, it seems that there is a little more emphasis on the actual fighting and the nature of the war and how it unfolded. I think you've hinted at it already, but I think there's more to say about how different our perceptions of it are versus what the reality actually was.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who've seen it 12 hours, and then you know that it really is very much about the war, the film. And it is about, I think, two themes in my mind. Well, there are more themes, but speaking of the war itself, that really stand out. One, again, is the Civil War character of it. The violence we already mentioned. That varies, of course, depending on when you're talking about and what region you're talking about. I think it's probably most Civil War-like in the southern theater of the war, but you see atrocities, you see violence all throughout the 8 years. We also, I think, have to remember the global dimension of the war. I think the documentary does a really great job emphasizing the global dimension. Of course, the entry of France into the war, officially in the spring of 78, informally already before then, late. I think it's important to keep in mind. They were there kind of watching for a couple of years to kind of figure out how things are going. But once France enters, then you have a global war essentially, because the fighting involves colonial possessions in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, and even South Asia. Spain enters. the Dutch support the Americans. The list is pretty long. I mean, I think that's something that the documentary also shows. And the last point I just want to make related to this question is the documentary does a very good job fully integrating Native Americans into the narrative, which is so important. Not just as allies of the British or the Americans, depending again on the time and where they are, but also how they're affected by this struggle essentially over land, especially in the West.
Well, once France enters the war, the North government offers the Americans everything that they wanted except independence. Everything else, no more taxes, nothing. We won't interfere with you at all. You're free to do what you want. Just remain part of the empire. It's too late. But that's the Carlisle Commission comes over here and tries to. It's just too late. It's amazing to me how the Brits continued, given the fact that there were huge numbers of Englishmen who were opposed to the war.
Right.
You know, there were about 600 pamphlets on both sides of the Atlantic published dealing with what the English called the American question. And 400 of those were published in Great Britain. And most of those were opposed to the war. They had a lot of Joan Fondas in Britain at the time. People really deeply opposed to what the British government was doing. And I think it's George III who's the hardliner. He really, North wants to resign. He can't take it anymore, and George holds on to him. It's a complicated situation politically. It's almost to me, the most confusing question is why did the Brits hang on and do what they did as long as they did? They could have settled so much easily since they ended up with independence anyhow. But you know, we've done some things ourselves.
I was going to say, it's like, why does the North hold on in the Civil War? You know, I mean, there are a lot of parallels, I suppose. So that's interesting. So you're suggesting that I had not thought of it this way before, that it really was the king more so than the ministry that really wanted to keep it going.
The king was a real player. He's not like the king today in England. He comes into office he succeeds to the throne. His grandfather died. His father had died before before he could take over. So he succeeds his grandfather in 1760, and he's only 22, I think, full of all kinds of. He's the first of the Hanoverian monarchs who was raised in England and spoke English naturally. So it's a new experience, and he just confuses the politics immediately with his behavior and puts in power Granville. Of course, from the English point of view, it's perfectly sensible that they should have tried to tax the Americans. They had enormous debt, 140 million, which was astronomical, 40 million pounds. And they were taxed to the hilt themselves. In fact, when they tried to impose a tax in the cider tax, the apple growing counties revolted and created chaos in England itself. So I think one can understand why they wanted some revenues, particularly since the war that cost so much, the 7 Years' War, was fought on behalf of the Americans, it seemed to the English at least. And they had freed the Americans of this French force that was at their rear. So from every conceivable rational point of view, the Stamp Act seemed sensible, but it provoked outrage in America.
Go ahead.
And just to add to this, obviously there were Hessians that fought on the British side, which, by the way, I also think helped the war going for a number of years because they were able to add manpower.
Right.
An estimated 30,000 German soldiers fought on the British side. And we have accounts when the Hessians first come to New York in the summer of '76, and they look at the countryside, they look at the farms, they look at the villages and so forth, and they admire generally what they're seeing. And what they're saying is like, what are the Americans complaining about? I mean, they have been able to grow so prosperous under this king, you know, and here they are rebelling, and they don't get it, why a little tax or anything like that would be cause for rebellion, especially, of course, considering where they're coming from, where they're Germans in the Holy Roman Empire, heavily burdened with all kinds of taxes and stuff like that. But, you know, from their perspective, it's like they have no reason to rebel.
Yeah. It's interesting to think of the weakness of, I mean, it's always stuck in my mind that the British Isles become a net importer of wheat in the 1760s. So they're not really even able to feed themselves at a certain point without reaching out. And yet and maybe that has a lot to do with why they're desperately trying to hold on to these colonies, because they're a number one trading partner by that point.
But of course, the irony is they lose the colonies, but nobody's hurt. The Americans flourish, the English flourish. They go on to have still the greatest empire that had ever existed. So it was, in that sense, a wasted war with hundreds of thousands of people killed or injured. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, that is extraordinary to think about. What was it for? If the result was going to be the same anyway. Frederica, talk to us a little bit more about you said the war it figures very prominently in this Ken Burns series. I mean, this is an important part of it. What do you think, in addition to some of the things you've said, what are some of the things that you think people should know about the war itself? Because we do have this sort of version of, well, this mighty British redcoat force is here, and then there are these rabble in the countryside, out in Concord or whatever, and they just sort of assemble and they shoot them up a little bit. How do you explain the American perseverance ultimately in this conflict?
Well, it's not just about winning a battle. For the British, it's not just about winning a battle. It is ultimately going to be about winning over the people and persuading the people that it is a better option to remain within the British Empire, I think. And that is ultimately they're unable to do that. I think one of the historians, I think it's Joseph Aldous, who says in the documentary, one thing that the Americans realized pretty quickly, specifically George Washington, that he doesn't have to win the war, he just has to not lose it. And I think it's a good way of looking at it as well. The Americans are not aiming to conquer anything, or, they just need to not be defeated completely. That's different for the British.
So the strategy then is just to wear them down,
And you see that throughout the war, I think. Like in the South, Nathaniel Greene, in George Washington, he has a couple of major engagements, but it's basically like avoiding major engagements, which is extremely frustrating for the British, like General Howe and Clinton. They want to meet them on the battlefield, so to speak, and the Americans are very good at avoiding that, at least after the very bad fall of '76.
Washington wants to have a confrontation at the outset, but he comes to realize this is crazy. But he never loses that feeling. I'm not much of a general if I keep retreating. But I think it was he came to realize that and he does say at one point, even if we lose battles, I'm going to be a guerrilla fighter. He didn't mention the used term guerrilla, partisan. He would go into the country, into the back country, and he would continue the fight. I think from my point of view, the Brits never had a chance of winning. The analogy with Vietnam is very, very good. The logistics, trying to fight a war millions of miles away against a population you don't know that well, and the Brits certainly don't know the Americans. Even though they're cousins, they really don't quite figure out why the Americans are fighting so strongly. For the reasons that you just suggested. Why are they complaining? They've got a wonderful land here.
And they're underestimating the British over and over again. You see this, Burgoyne, when Burgoyne launches the campaign from Quebec into northern New York, they're like, there's going to be plenty of loyalists, they'll flock to us and support us. That never happens. And I think when Cornwallis in the South, same thing. He feels Georgia is basically a loyalist colony, people will join, and that never happens. I mean, people will be fighting each other. There are certainly loyalists, but the support for the crown forces never materializes, and I think that's a real miscalculation. They just don't.
The Brits always assume that there's a natural loyalty to the crown, and Well, there's some reason for that. You know, people talk about the Boston Massacre, 1770, but there was a St. George's Fields Massacre in England itself in 1768, in which I think 7 or 8 people were killed, more than the Boston Massacre. So England was used to this kind of disorder in violence in its own country. There were all kinds of riots going on. North almost lost his life at the door of the House of Commons. So when the violence takes place in America, they don't see it the way they should have, we think, because they say, well, we're a violent people ourselves. And this is just what's an extension of what's going on in England itself. So the Boston Massacre is no surprise to them because they had the St. George's Fields Massacre 2 years earlier, in which more people were killed. That is, redcoats shooting its own citizens. So it made it difficult to figure out. It starts with Massachusetts, and they think it really is just a bunch of these ex-Puritans who have never really learned to live under a monarchy. And I think they misjudged the thing right from the beginning as located and confined to this single colony of Massachusetts.
Right. That was always the strategy, right? If we can cut Massachusetts off, then everything else will be fine. They can just isolate it, but of course that didn't prove to be the case. You mentioned Washington and maybe some doubts he had about, well, what kind of a general am I if I'm already in retreat? And I know there have been people who have written about, was Washington really a great general? I mean, maybe not so much. I'd be interested what you both think about that. Just from a military perspective, I mean, was he, how would he rank as a military leader?
Oh, I think he's got a kind of Eisenhower view. He's a very astute politician. He understands he has to keep his political fences mended. He lets the Continental Congress know about what's happening. He was not a great strategist, I don't think, or even a tactician. I think he took risks that he should never have taken. At Monmouth, for example, he's the general commander-in-chief. He's almost in the front lines. He should never have been doing that. But as a political leader, he was superb. There could have been no better general than him, than Washington, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I think he is also he's very good at uniting I mean, he's basically creating a continental army and very good at uniting people that were not united. And I also think he's very good at surrounding himself with very good officers.
He knew talent.
He knew talent. So
Greene, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's a real, ultimately.
That was Eisenhower's claim too. I mean, Eisenhower no one else could have brought all those people together for D-Day.
Right.
And people realized that.
Yeah. You mentioned, we talk about Washington. Let's talk about Adams for a minute. You know, here we are. He and his family are buried right below us. And of course, this is the Adams Presidential Center, so we do have to get an Adams question in here. But, you know, we talk about, you know, Washington and all that he did. I mean, and you're both exactly right. I mean, there could have been no one better to sort of give definite. There would be no country without George Washington, clearly. And historians have said Washington was the sword, Jefferson was the pen, but Adams was the voice of the revolution. I mean, how do you assess Adams' role in, not just in specific things like the Declaration, but in the whole arc of the story in terms of what the revolution was, what it becomes? How important is he?
Well, he was second to Washington as president, so people must have thought he was important. I think he was the crucial person in the Continental Congress, I think driving the Congress to independence. And if he'd had his way and his cousin Samuel Adams, they would have had declared independence in 1770 or much earlier. But they had, as Adams put it, we're in a convoy. We can't go any faster than our slowest ship. And so he had enough political sense to curb his enthusiasm. But he was, I think, crucial in driving the Congress to independence. And more than that, he was important in constitution making and so on. He wrote a pamphlet as early as the spring of 1776 advising the various would-be states how to draw up a constitution. So he's crucial, and it's really sad because he was appointed to the committee. Naturally, he was on about 24 committees, chairing, I think, a dozen of them, including the Committee on War. He's essentially fighting the war from the political point of view. And he assigns the task of drawing up the Declaration to this young squirt who just arrived from Virginia, who was late, as usual. And he had written a wonderful pamphlet in 1774 that showed that he had a real ease with language. And he is a Virginian, and he's young, and so Adams signs him the Declaration of Independence. Adams came to regret that very much later when the author, so-called author of the Declaration by the 1790s, early 19th century, is being celebrated as Jefferson is being celebrated as the author, and it goes to his head. He lists it as one of the things he wants put on his tombstone. Number 1, author of the Declaration of Independence. Adams is so jealous, so envious. He says the author, he was just a draftsman. And if he'd known how important it would be, he would have written it himself. There's no doubt. Poor John.
Poor John. He really did. No, it is interesting to think about all that he had to do with everything behind the scenes. And he really was, as an orator, as a force, I mean, a very powerful presence, much more so than Jefferson or even Washington in terms of oratory and that kind of thing. And yet, I think even in his own lifetime, he recognized that. And, Jefferson's a rock star and Adams is just kind of sulking here at Quincy.
Right, that's right. In the exchange of letters at one point in 1820 or so, he's writing about 3 to Jefferson's 1. They had this wonderful exchange, as you perhaps know, at the end of their lives. And he's writing many more letters than Jefferson. And so he writes to him and says, "How many letters, Mr. Jefferson, did you receive last year?" And Jefferson says, "Well, I received 1,200 or so." And Adams is appalled. He says, he received only 120. And he realizes that Jefferson's corresponding with the Tsar of Russia, with various German scientists. He's in a different celebrity league. And Adams comes to realize that. It's just 2 different worlds they were living in at the end.
So we've got you're stimulating a lot of response here. I've got a handful of questions here from the audience, but one of them has to do with how the war gets prolonged. We talked about it being a long and violent war, and somebody's asking about the severity of the winters of 75, 76, and 77. How did that either benefit or prolong the war? What role did the weather play in some of that?
Well, I think actually climate is a major factor in the Revolutionary War for all sides, but maybe more so for the British and German soldiers than for the Americans, because many of them had never been exposed to that kind of environment. I think it makes it very difficult to fight war in places like Canada, for example, or also the South in the summer, the heat and the diseases that often come with those kind of things. I'm not sure about how the winter specifically prolonged the war, but I mean, we know, of course, that some of these winters, most famously Valley Forge, although the following winter is probably colder at Morristown, presented real test for the Americans in particular, the Continental Army that is suffering tremendous hardship. And what does that mean? Well, that means, there are many of them are dying. Many of these troops are dying, and also there are women and children in these camps. I think we should always remember that. But it also forces the Americans to send out foraging parties into the countryside, and that affects, to some extent, how some of the locals feel about the presence of the Americans who are taking their cow or, corn or whatever to feed the army. So the weather has a different effect. Can have various effects on the war and on the military and on troops.
Of course, in the 18th century, normally you go into winter quarters. That's one of the differences between our modern wars, and so you don't have fighting. You usually have fighting in the war during winter, but that was the brilliance of Washington's Trenton on Christmas Day to cross the.
It was not fair.
I was thinking of that example of Trenton and the crossing in the winter.
He was desperate at that point. It really was the time that tries men's souls that Payne talked about. I mean, they had lost everything at New York. They were in retreat. Had crossed the Hudson, and it just looked very bad. And some people who had signed the Declaration of Independence began coming out of the woodwork and saying, "No, I'm going to devote myself to the crown." It was a bad time, and so Washington's timing was perfect. And it was a small base, about 900 Hessians, right? And it was a brilliant piece of warfare. But it was good for morale.
Yes.
I mean, one of the problems that Howe had, it seems to me, in New Jersey, was the Tories, or the Loyalists, always expected to have royal troops nearby, because if they didn't, the Whigs, who were in majority, the Whigs or the Patriots, would oppress them, harass them. So he needed to spread his troops around to accompany or accommodate these loyalists. As a consequence, he had a number of isolated posts. Princeton and Trenton were two of them, and Washington took advantage of that. In the end, I think, as Frederica said, the Brits misunderstood the degree to which the Americans were supporting this revolution. They simply misunderstood how little loyalist support there was.
When you think about Trenton, obviously that surprise attack on the Hessians, that Christmas attack that is so successful, that really sort of changes things, at least for a while there. And when you all buy Frederica's book, when it comes out in paperback in the spring, you'll be able to read about more than just that particular event. But tell us, Frederica, a little bit about, because I think there's this sense that, well, the Hessians were there and there was this kind of surprise attack, but the idea that they had a much broader influence in the world, which is what you, and again, just to restate why this is such an important work, obviously Frederica, born and raised in Germany, is able to read those original source documents in ways that other historians have not been able to do. And so she really has the scoop on that story, if you will, in terms of being a great revolutionary historian looking at those things. But tell us about why the Hessian influence was important, and sort of how that played out, and how it was broader than just being in Trenton and Princeton and a few places.
And by the way, and you may not remember this, but when I visited graduate programs trying to decide where I would study early American history, we met, and you asked me whether I can read German and the German script, because some of you might know this. The German script, the 18th century, looks very different from modern German script. And I said, yeah, I can read it. And he said, you should do something with German sources. There are a lot of German sources relating to early American history. You may not remember this, but I do, because I had no idea, to be honest with you. I was like, really? Okay. I mean, of course, I knew that there were a lot of German immigrants in America, but I had no idea the sheer...
A third of the population of Pennsylvania was German.
Yeah, there's a lot of German materials. And my first book deals with Germans in Pennsylvania. But for this one, it's a huge body of material, literally hundreds, thousands of letters, journals. It's incredible. That was written by those German soldiers or members of the Corps describing their experience in America. And studying this material really reveals a much more complicated, interesting picture than the one that we, I think, commonly have.
Right.
So I already mentioned 30,000 soldiers served roughly in North America. And just to put this into perspective, that means that by 1781 or so, fully 1/3 of the British regular army force is German. So that's a huge number that they're relying on. And yes, Trenton is famous. I'd say most people also, or many people also know of Saratoga, the defeated Saratoga. Half the troops there are German. Maybe Yorktown, which is also one that a major American victory. So all American victories. But German soldiers were in Canada, Quebec. Some of them spent the entire war there. They fought in every battle, pretty much every skirmish, from Quebec all the way to Pensacola. We even have some German soldiers on Cuba at some point. And so I think their role is a very, very important one. They occupy places like Savannah and Charleston, for example, for quite a long time after the defeat at Yorktown. It's another thing that people often think Yorktown, the war is over. And it is sort of over. There's no major battle after that. But the war, Yorktown is in the fall of 1781. The war isn't actually over until a couple of years later. Right. And there remain large numbers of Germans in the South. So they're at Newport, they're at Philadelphia, they're of course in New York.
Well, you told me a story.
So I think it's important to keep that in mind. They're everywhere, participate in all of these.
Including Quincy, Massachusetts. You told me a little anecdote before we came out, so share that with this audience. That would be
just quickly. So the question. So of course the first German soldiers come to North America in the summer of '76. So they're not here for Concord and Lexington and Breeds Hill and all of that. They land in New York, and then many others land in Canada. And they, several thousands of them, participate in '77 in Burgoyne's campaign. And they're of course defeated at Saratoga, and they become prisoners of war, what we know as the Convention Army. Those troops, the British and the Germans, are sent to Cambridge, Massachusetts, because the idea is to send them home. That never happens. They're spent approximately 14 months or so in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I mentioned to Kurt, my cave...
This is another example of how different the 18th century warfare was. So you explain the
I mean, the troops, they live in some barracks that had been constructed for the Americans earlier. Of course, the officers renting mansions on what was then Torrey Road, now Brattle Street. They're having balls in honor of the King and Queen's birthday. That is
This is the army that was defeated at Saratoga.
The officers are allowed to keep their sidearms. I mean, it is a world, you're right, we cannot imagine.
But then they go on to Virginia.
Then they go to Charlottesville. And of course, several officers befriend Thomas Jefferson, and they play the violin with him. And because, why? I think because the part of it is class, of course. Right? It's like these people mingling with each other, and they know French, and they play instruments and all of that. But it is a world that we can't imagine. But the story about Quincy that I think, Kurt, you wanted to very, very quickly. Yeah. So one of the commander of the troops, the German, these are actually not, the Germans that are with Burgoyne are from the territory of Braunschweig or Brunswick and Hessen-Hanau. Some of you might know that. There are approximately 2,500 of them, so they're in Cambridge. And the commander of these troops, his name is Friedrich Adolf Wiedesel. Some of you might know about his wife. He's there with his wife and 3 daughters, actually. Federica Wiedesel is her name. He corresponds, I found letters in his papers, and several letters exchanged with Colonel Josiah Quincy, because what do they talk about? Gardening. So Wiedesel lives in the mansion on Brattle Street and is sending letters to Josiah Quincy. Hey, I have some seeds for some herbs and some saplings, and can you please trade them for? And he sends literally an order of plants that he wants from Josiah Quincy. And at some point, Josiah Quincy says, "Don't you have a German soldier there in those barracks that knows some gardening?" And he's like, "Yeah, I have someone." And he sends a prisoner of war, basically, down to Josiah Quincy to garden, to help him establish those plants that they had traded. Yeah, a very different world.
Right.
This is a prisoner of war, and he's befriending essentially the prominent locals, and so we have that correspondence.
It's hard to imagine a horticultural component to modern warfare. I think that is different indeed.
Well, if you ever see the movie The Grand Illusion, the officers, the French and German officers, come to realize they have more in common with each other than they do with their enlisted men.
Oh, yeah.
And that's something that I think Jefferson realizes. He sat right at home with these British officers and these German officers, and he talks about them as his equals.
Yeah.
I actually do really think Jefferson, and there are some other ones as well, they love the fact that there finally is a social life in Charlottesville, basically.
Right.
I mean,
it's
a tiny village.
It must have been so boring at Monticello.
I mean, the British built a theater there. I'm not kidding. They built a theater there, and they have performances. And we have documents like Jefferson and this lady, whatever, in the box watching the British officers perform.
There's a good book in this story. Somebody should write that book.
So,
Well, you mentioned a good movie, so someone writes here a question for you, Gordon. Dr. Wood, many lay people know know your name from the movie Good Will Hunting. When Will told his friends that in order to educate himself, he needed to read Gordon Wood. So you're one of the most famous American historians, but what would you want to be remembered for as a defining contribution of your career?
That's.
I mean, a cameo on Goodwill maybe is.
That was my 2 seconds of fame.
I think it's his last 2 graduate students.
I think
that's
so.
right.
That's right.
Well, that's
You can't.
I was not,
Two different.
those 2 guys, Affleck and what's his name?
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon. They were Boston boys, and they were dropouts at Harvard. Turns out that you're better off leaving Harvard than.
Yeah.
And they just picked out something from a review I'd done in the New York Review of Books. They didn't contact me. A graduate student, one of my graduate students, wrote me and said, "Let me be the first to inform you that you're in a movie."
You're gonna make the local team proud here. A couple of questions were about the documentary and I think this would apply even to books that you've written, for example. And the question is, how do you decide what to leave out of something like that? And I know that Ken Burns is the one that does the edit. His team does the editing. It wasn't up to you what went in and didn't go in, but it's interesting to think about not just what we say when we put something together, whether it's an exhibit or a book or a documentary, it's what we don't say. And so are there things that you think should have been said in the documentary, for example, like a couple of little things that you wish maybe could have been covered, or even in books that you think you wish you'd had a little more time to develop something? What are some of those things that get kind of left on the cutting room floor? Any big things?
I mean, 12 hours is already a lot. And there is just no way. And I think the whole team, and I think when we write books too, we know we can't possibly. It's literally impossible to cover everything, literally. And you have to make some tough choices. And I think that the team the Florentin Films team was very much aware of that as well. When I watched the film several times, kind of early iterations, and I read the script several times, and they were always looking for what are we missing, or what should we possibly take out, and there were some recommendations for events that some of us would think important. For example, I think, from my perspective, some of you might have heard the Meschianza. I think such a great story. That celebration in Philadelphia when General Howe left and was replaced with General Clinton. There was a huge celebration in occupied Philadelphia with jousting matches, and fireworks. Anyway, it was such a demonstration of British power during the war. This is in '78. And I made a case for that. It's not in the film. And why is it not in the film? Their argument was we were talking earlier about John Andre, or there was something that to them felt would then distract from something that was more important. But you know what I mean? So I think there are these...
Probably Benedict Arnold.
Or Benedict, exactly, something like that. And that, so they're trying to tell a story, and you're looking at the flow, and you're looking at, so some things will just not make it.
But look, Thomas Paine at one point says, if the revolution is just the war, then it's not very important. And I think that's important to keep in mind. It is a prerequisite for what happened, because without winning, the new country could not be created. But this is not like the French-Algerian War. It's not like the Algerians breaking away from France and setting up a separate country. It's got to be more important than that. In fact, it may be the most important event in the last 400 years. I mean, here is this, when you think about these little colonies scattered along the east coast of North America, starting in 1607, near starving colonists, and in 400 years emerges as the greatest, richest, most powerful nation the world's ever known. I mean, that's a great saga. It certainly rivals the rise and fall of Rome or the rise and fall of the British Empire. So it's not over yet, I hope, but it's a really extraordinary saga that needs to be portrayed, not just in a movie, but in many different ways. And we're in the middle of it in some sense.
No, that's a great point, the sort of universal nature of it as well. I mean, this has an import beyond just what this
definitely.
country becomes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this
Just
affects the
because
whole
of the
world.
power of the United States.
Absolutely.
Without us, the war, World War II, who knows what would have
Right.
happened.
How do we teach the revolution or convey to people this sort of central importance of the revolution and that it applies to everybody? I mean, some of the questions, several questions here are about, for example, talk about the influence of black soldiers on the strategies of both sides. I mean, what you mentioned in the series that the Native American perspective has been brought to the fore. Certainly we know a lot more today about women's role in these conflicts and in the revolution itself, meaning more than just the war, but what happens. So how do we account for
Well, we do
everybody?
this, we've done it recently, as you perhaps know, with the 1619 Project. We're going through a period of immense atonement over slavery, and that 1619 Project happened right in the middle of a whole series of crises, the George Floyd crisis and so on. So it's understandable. I consider this to be, I guess you'd call it memory, not history. Memory is very important, and a similar kind of thing went on with the Lost Cause after the Civil War. The South created its own picture of what happened that emerged between 1900 and 1920, and that's when all these statues went up of Lee and other Confederate generals. It's popular memory. It's important to people. It's very emotional laden, but it's not history, and historians have to correct that. And I consider the 1619 Project, which claimed that Americans went to war to preserve slavery because the British were were in the process of abolishing slavery, which of course was not true. And so that became part of one journalist's attempt to somehow have an impact. It did have an impact, and the New York Times, a very powerful institution in the country, has promoted that for the last 4 or 5 years. But it is not history, and I think slowly people will come to realize that. It is part of what I would call the great atonement we're going through in our culture, as you all know that, I think. You have to be from Mars if you didn't understand that. And so I think that accounts for there's a division between what I would call popular memory, and I class the Lost Cause in that same kind of category. No one pays much attention to that now because historians have whittled away and destroyed.
Corrected that.
Yeah, I think the Ken Burns documentary does a very good job acknowledging, and well, not just acknowledging, but showing the complexities the contradictions of the revolution and the revolutionary ideals, including, of course, that many people, including of our founders, owned slaves.
Although Adams did not. Just to be clear.
But I said many.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that is a reality too. And one of the things I really like about the film is that it follows certain individuals over the course of the war. Again, if you've watched it, you know what I'm talking about. People whose names we often don't know, but we know from their diaries or the records that they lived through the war. And one, for example, is James Forten, a freeborn black man in Philadelphia who joins a privateer and is captured by the British and so on, and makes a decision ultimately not to go to Britain as a free man, but to return to the United States and take a chance, in a sense, of having a life as an American. I think the film does not argue that the Americans fought this over slavery, which does not argue anything along the lines of what the 69 Project did. I think it incorporates these complex, also often contradictory, I would say facts or stories into this narrative.
My good friend Joe Ellis has a new book out called The Contradictions of the... And I think he's made a mistake in the case of slavery. I don't think it was a contradiction. I think we made a stand against slavery. You know, slavery had existed for thousands of years. Thousands of years without substantial criticism. Hard it is for us to understand that. But, Aristotle had slaves. Plato had slaves. They didn't worry about it. There was no anti-slavery movement until the American Revolution. It's the Americans and the northern states, and this state in particular, who make slavery a problem. They abolish it. This is the first example in the history of the world where these 8 northern states abolish an institution that had legally existed, slavery. Now, the numbers were small compared to those that existed in the South. The South could not do that. But I don't see the American Revolution as having a contradiction. They are the American revolutionaries are the ones who really foretell the end of slavery. They end it in the northern states and they put it on the defensive in the South. And it's just a matter of time and a civil war. But slavery is criticized for the first time and abolished for the first time in history. So I think that's something that we should celebrate and understand. They weren't able to do the whole thing. But what they did was, I think, put it on the road to extinction.
Set it in motion. Yeah, absolutely. So when, you make an interesting point that there's unfinished work, there's unfinished business that goes on to the Civil War and even beyond that. When does it end? When does the revolution end?
Well, some people would say it's still going on, I suppose. My own feeling, it ends with the Jacksonian period. That there's when equality has reached its ultimate limit. Jackson says in his campaign, this is on the platform, that anyone at all can hold political office. Doesn't matter whether you went to Harvard or Princeton or any college. It didn't matter whether you had any money or you could speak or you were a plebeian or not. It just didn't matter. Anyone could hold political office. That's, in his mind, in the supporters' mind, the ultimate reductio ad absurdum of the notion of equality.
Which was obviously not the norm up to that point. I mean, the idea that just some ordinary guy could be elected to something was not.
No, that's not at all what they meant. Now, I think it's important to understand what that all men are created equal really means. Think about it literally. We're all created the same, with the same blank slate. This was kind of a Lockean epistemology. This is how we're all born. We're all born the same. And many people, not Jefferson, unfortunately, but many slaveholders believed that blacks in Africa were born with the same blank slate that the slaveholder in South Carolina or Virginia was. But experience, circumstances operating on this blank slate created the differences that existed in the society. And there are obvious differences. That's what they meant by all men are created equal. So what the implications of that, of course, is suddenly education. Education becomes an obsession because you get this blank slate and you can actually write your own, we can change the culture, change the society by educating people. And of course, Americans have been obsessed by education. But the other implication is once elites realized that people weren't born to be what they became, that they could do something about it. And for the first time in Western history, at least, you have people having a humanitarian interest. That's where anti-slavery comes from. And that's concern for poverty. Suddenly they realize that the downtrodden in the society can be rescued. People prior to the late 18th century assumed that that's the way it is. If there are poor people in the society, well, that's the way it is. We can't do anything about it. That's essentially how they're born that way and they'll remain that way. But if you suddenly realize that if through education or through changing the circumstances of these people, their environments, in other words, it's all nurture, no nature. That's the basic insight of the Enlightenment, as we call it. And the Americans picked that up in spades, so to speak, and really push it. And that is what is important about those five words in the Declaration. And of course, later it gets expanded, people come to believe that, well, all men are the same. And I'm as good as the next guy, and that's really the ultimate kind of American position. I used to have arguments with my Australian friends who always felt that they were the most egalitarian people in the world because they had that mateship, you know, and and I said, yes, but your equality has a sense of an edge to it. And it's those pommy bastards they hate. And we don't have that. Americans, and you see them if you tour in Europe, you see them, and of course we're conspicuous because of our sense of ourselves. We're as good as the next person. And that kind of equality, I think, is really central to being an American.
That's great. Question here from the audience about, you mentioned that taxation seemed very reasonable from the British point of view. So if they were willing to put taxes on, why did they not allow representation of the colonists in the parliament? Why wouldn't they allow them to have representatives?
They would. I think if that had been proposed by anybody, and Franklin makes a mistake and suggested at some point, the Brits would have loved that. That would have solved their problem. Bring 100 more Americans over. The Parliament was already 558 or so. Mm-hmm. They brought in 100 Scots, and they allowed they taxed the Scots with 100 members, so they could bring in 100 Americans. But the Americans realized instinctively they did not want that because they would never be in control of the Parliament. They would just be victimized by this. And of course, they'd be 3,000 miles away from their constituents, these representatives. No, that was never in the cards for the Americans. They rejected that notion right at the outset.
Yeah. Frederica, turning back to the war for just a moment and thinking about the documentary and all that, your books, if you, when we think about a message for younger people or an audience that maybe is not as informed as you are about the war, what are some of the big messages or lessons that you would have people take from the war itself? I mean, what would you have people understand about it that would be maybe helpful or instructive to modern life?
Yeah, I think, that's
It's a waste. They didn't need to fight. They didn't. I mean, the Brits lost, and they could have done that right from the outset. Just said, all right, you guys could go. It was just a terrible mistake, and most wars are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Vietnam was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a mistake. The Brits just simply...
Is that the message, there are no good wars?
That is one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a good question. I mean, when for this particular war, if you believe this war really was about ideals, which, then it's complicated. Is there a time that you should stand up for your ideals and fight for your...
Well, I don't think it was a mistake for the Americans to fight.
Yeah.
I'm saying it was a mistake for the British
to keep going.
They should have conceded immediately.
Yeah.
No, the Americans had to fight. If the Brits are going to fight, they needed to fight to create their country.
So I think there is a time to fight for the right reasons, so to speak, which I think in this particular case they had good reasons.
But the British, I mean, they can't. They surely were on solid ground to think these people can't possibly stand up to what we are and what we represent militarily. I mean, they're such a powerful nation.
Absolutely,
right? I mean,
that was the assumption.
So to concede immediately, was that seriously considered, the idea that we should just not bother? Yeah.
No, but I think the British should have. They could have realized after a couple of campaigns. Don't you think, at least after Saratoga, I think
then it's a world war. They can't really...
But it becomes clear... Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, when you go back, when you look at the fall of '76, for example, the first major campaign, that goes pretty well for the British, except for Trenton. Which is not a big. As you mentioned, the time is important. It's a morale booster. It's really important for the Americans. But when you look at the campaign and it actually goes pretty well for the British, and I think that reinforces that idea that we're just running over. And every time the Americans just run away, basically. Right. And then Trenton, that's disappointing, okay. And then I think in 76 with Saratoga, at that point, I think it's pretty clear, it was obviously the French that the Americans really had a chance. But like you're suggesting, at that
It's a world war. At that point, the
It's
British
almost too
can't.
late.
They got to deal with France.
Yeah.
But you know, in June at Bunker Hill, they lose what 40% casualties of their 2,000 troops, and those are horrendous losses. And he thinks this is not going to work. Already it's in his mind that this is a mistake, but each step seemed, and before they know it, they're in a world war, and then you can't change that. They had to fight.
And the Caribbean, I mean, they're also fighting to keep the Caribbean, which is probably
that's right. So it was incremental. Each step seemed sensible.
Yeah.
I mean, after Lexington, the Battle of Lexington should have convinced them this is not going to be easy. We better rethink this. And Gates, who was the general, suggested that. He said, these people are not a bunch of mobs. This is people who are willing to fight for their, and somehow the Brits just didn't quite, in each step they get one.
One thing, and we suggested the distance earlier as a real challenge. We have to also remember that Gates, how Clinton, those people might have had reservations or hesitations, but they're in America.
That's right.
And they're far away, and by the time any communication reaches London, and then they're dealing with these people that are out of touch for the most part, and then they're communicating. That's a huge issue. So even if commanding generals in America believe this is not working, or we should be doing that, or we should.
That's right.
It's incredibly hard to communicate.
The political leadership at home, as in the case of us in Vietnam, has to bear ultimate responsibility because they simply didn't take the advice of people who.
But it seems interesting too when you think about the British. I mean, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, right? They've just become this landed. I mean, they've got all this additional land. The idea that they would have conceded some of that and backed away from that, I think that maybe have been a complicating factor, at least for the people in London who are trying to call the shots, right? Why would we back away?
Well, they didn't have to back away in 1765. All they had to do was not tax them. See, nobody was asking. There was nobody in America who was suggesting independence in the 60s,
right. Oh, for sure.
At least publicly. And so it's the taxation that then the Americans begin thinking, if they can treat us that way, then people begin thinking, wow, we're growing at double the rate of the English. Our population will be equal to England by the early 19th century. Why should we put up with this? And suddenly you have a change of thought. But I don't think in 1760, when the new king comes to the throne, these celebrations in Philadelphia and Boston and Charleston are really exciting. There's a new king, a king who speaks English.
Right.
That's great.
No, I just meant that the idea that even once they get into the war, that they would think about walking away from all the land. At that point, they would be.
But after 78, after the French, it's a world war, and there's no possibility of suddenly saying, let's end this.
Right.
Because you really got to negotiate with your major enemy.
And Spain, I mean, not as an ally of the Americans, but because they're allied with France, enters the war, and they want the Floridas back. So there's all these other interests then very quickly.
Several questions here. A couple are asking about sort of how is it that Massachusetts ends up being the nexus of all this? And of course, from this audience, the question is usually phrased like, how is it that Massachusetts is so far ahead of all the other colonies in this regard? So take that as you will. You don't have to make that part of the question. But they're functioning as independent colonies. Why is it that Massachusetts becomes the epicenter of at least the beginning of?
Well, Massachusetts is a wealthy colony in the sense that it's sophisticated and developed, but it's not wealthy by standards of Barbados or any of or the southern colonies even. But it's a strong, quite established colony. I mean, what happens in Rhode Island, my own state now, in 1772. Actually, a mob attacks a naval warship, His Majesty's warship, and burns it to the, you know,
Water line.
to the water line, and they send over a commission. They're going to punish people, but they can't get anybody to testify. But Rhode Island is insignificant, and Connecticut is insignificant. They're both corporate colonies. They don't have a royal governor. They're not really important, and so Rhode Island gets ignored. But in Massachusetts, when they begin to have some problems, the Brits react in strange ways. They bring troops in. They bring 4,000 troops into Boston in the late 60s because there have been mobbings. There's no doubt that the mobs are common in the 18th century. They're common in England and they're common in America. They're not necessarily always destructive, but they can be. The mobs that destroy the Stamp Act were very destructive, and in that case, they actually used the mob to invade and destroy Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house. But so Massachusetts is a place of disorder. So they bring the troops in, and you've got 4,000 troops living in a city of 15,000 people. Now, there's bound to be a problem with those kinds of numbers. Even though the troops had become kind of integrated. There's a new book, or a relatively new book in the last 10 years by Sabin on how much they'd been into and actually the soldiers were making themselves at home. But still, troops in a civilian population of those numbers, that's when you have the Boston Massacre. And that's 1770, and the troops are pulled out. It was the little things like that, and it led the British officials to believe that the source of the problems we're getting from America are confined to Massachusetts. They're the ones who are the problem. And it's the Tea Party is a crucial event. It's Adams's sense, Samuel Adams' sense that he's got to move things along. I mean, you might say, from the British point of view, Samuel Adams, terrorist, because certainly that's what he was. He takes advantage of the fact that the tea was the one thing that had not been, the tax on tea had not been removed in the Townsend duties. And he organizes a group to go aboard the ship and destroy 10,000 pounds of tea. Pounds meaning value, probably $1 million or more of property. The Virginians are appalled by this. George Washington says that this is private property being destroyed, what's going on? There's no sympathy for Massachusetts at that point. And the Brits should have understood that, because I think they could have weathered that whole thing, because everything looks bad for Massachusetts. It was a real terrorist attack. Nobody was killed, but property was destroyed. And in terms of the 18th century, that was a serious move. And the Brits react. How do they react? The coercive acts. They close the port of Boston. They do away with the town meetings, except allow one meeting a year to vote supplies. They changed the judiciary. They changed the charter. They removed Gates, who's a military man, removed the civilian leaders, Hutchinson, and imposed a military general as governor. Those coercive acts changed everything. That's the decisive moment. From then, I don't think there's any stopping the revolution.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, Federico, when I hear that, I think about it's like these little accidents, right? These little things that happen. That if one or two things had been different. I mean, have you ever given any thought to the fact that, and we've got a question here from the audience, and I know we don't necessarily speak in terms of sort of counterfactual things, because there's no way to go back and say, well, if this hadn't happened, then what would have happened? I mean, there's no way to know. But it does seem like the revolution didn't have to happen. I mean, there are plenty of things that could have happened to prevent it. How different would the world then and now be, do you think, if that hadn't occurred in that way?
Well, it obviously would have become independent sooner or later. I mean, Canada became independent. Right. That was a puny little place.
Yeah. I hope there are no Canadians in the audience.
No, but it was, there were at most 50,000 people there.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2.5 million Americans. They sooner or later, and they were growing demographically, they were growing at a faster rate. They're having more children, in other words, than the English. And because life was pretty good. And you have, that's one measure of prosperity is how many children you had in the 18th century. And they would have, sooner or later, a break would have occurred. It might have been more peaceful, but it would have occurred, I think, by the early 19th century.
But it's interesting to think of independence as inevitable.
Oh, definitely,
Yeah.
they had to break, I think, or else the Brits could have worked out a kind of dominion status.
But I wonder what it would have, whether the United States would have looked the way it does.
No,
you know?
that's a good question. I agree.
And first of all, I mean, even if you think about Western expansion, I mean, one reason, well, one argument is why the Americans are upset with the British ultimately is because the British don't want them to settle across the Appalachian, basically. They have the Proclamation line. It's like Indian territory, don't move there quite yet. Had the war not happened, had independence not happened at that time, would Western expansion have happened at the rate it did happen, which was incredibly fast? There would have probably been some, but the question is, what would have been the pace? Where would have, Anglo-Saxons or white settlers, or immigrants, where would they have gone? Then the related question to that would be also what would have happened to slavery or the expansion of slavery in those territories? And I think there's no guarantee that there would have been one United States ultimately. It's quite conceivable that there would have been more than one nation, or certain colonies would have broken off at some point, but not obviously the ones that broke off in 1776. I don't know. It's kind of fun maybe to think about it, but the Western expansion alone and the expansion across the territory, I think, would have looked differently and might have determined what would have happened eventually. But I do agree that sooner or later there would have been some independence, some movement.
Right. No,
I want to say, I have one more thing though to that. If you think about independence, American independence also of inspiring independence movements across the world, which I think it did, there would have been an impact as well. So had independence not happened in 76, I think that would have...
And in the way it happened.
And in the way it happened, the Declaration of Independence have written, and the language which has been copied or repeated across the world over and over again in different contexts. I mean, if we did not have that...
The Canadians got independence in 1867, the North American Act, and they have their own trinity. We have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They have peace, order, and good government. That tells you everything about the difference between Canada and the United States.
Doesn't sound so bad.
No, it's fine. It's just...
But if you didn't have these words, I mean, think about it. They're just words. Like you talked earlier, they use words, but they're very important words, and they really had an actual impact, I think, on people and anti-colonial movements elsewhere. So thinking about it in that way is interesting as well. It's not just what would have happened in the United States, maybe, but elsewhere.
I do think the Western movement would have continued. They would have.
But maybe not the pace.
I don't know.
There's a lot of pressure to grow.
Once the French were removed, once the end of the Peace of Paris in 1763, everyone saw that land out there as a...
They're all speculating. They're all buying land. They want the land too. Early on.
As Gordon's work points out, I mean, the revolution is much more than independence, or it's much more than even just the fighting the war. And I want to ask you in a moment, Frederica, about your favorite work of Gordon's, your favorite book, what you would point to. And I was going to take the plunge and go first and say that when Frederica and I showed up at Brown, Gordon had won the Bancroft Prize back in 1969 for his first book on the creation of the American Republic. And by the time we got there, he had just published The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And so I'm thinking, this man who was about the age we are now was an old guy who was ready to hang up his career. And I thought, what a great bookend that he's got. He starts with the Bancroft Prize, he ends with the Pulitzer Prize.
Well.
How little did I know that Pulitzer Prize was really more like a mid-career milestone for this great historian. And so I want to say that my favorite book is Friends Divided. It's the story of Adams and Jefferson, and it's really a tremendous character study. And it probably helped me more than any other book on Adams to understand sort of that relative positioning, seeing Jefferson, even still, as the rock star that he was and is, with all the flaws and all that. But Adams, as important as he was, never getting his due then and in some ways now. And of course, that's why we have the Adams Presidential Center to try and address some of that. But I think that it's interesting that I think that book, well, I think it's sort of, you'd agree, Frederick, it's sort of like his graduate students. I mean, he saved the best for last, clearly, wouldn't you think? In that sense. Go ahead, what do you think?
Well, I think probably for me the most, in a sense, influential was the radicalism book. And I think that has had such an impact on many people who had never really seen the revolution as radical, basically, especially compared to the French Revolution, for example. So I think that's probably the most, to me, influential. But I mean, since then, the Empire of Liberty, the putting all the bigger, it's very synthetic, big history of that, absolutely. And didn't you also write a biography of Franklin?
Franklin, the Americanization.
Yes, I remember, that one I also really enjoyed. Yeah, so there's a long list of books.
It's hard to keep up. So, Gordon, I'll give you the last word. If you think about what an organization like the Adams Center is trying to do to reach an audience with a message of the revolution, I mean, just distill it down for us in a couple of themes, a couple of big, what would be the last word on the revolution?
Well, the Adams family itself, of course, is fascinating. There's just nothing quite like it in this period. Abigail and John were really a unique couple. There's no doubt of it. But he's a constitutionalist. He is most important for drawing up the drawing up of the state constitutions in 1776, which Jefferson, in his wisdom, said this is the whole point of the project, meaning the whole point of the revolution is to erect these governments, because they were not going to just eliminate British tyranny, they're going to eliminate tyranny forever by drawing up a constitution. And Adams, they were already, many of the revolutionaries in various states, North Carolina, New Jersey, were thinking of their constitution by April or May of 76, well before the Declaration. And so they go to John, who's in the Continental Congress, and they say, give us some advice. And so he writes out several letters to people, this is what you ought to do. And he realizes he's getting besieged by these requests, so I'll just publish something. And it's one of his first major publications on constitutionalism is Thoughts on Government. And it has a powerful influence on the state constitutions which are erected, which is a monumental thing. I mean, really in history has any people been able to create its own government like that? Usually they just inherit it through time. This was a moment of constitution making, and so every state draws up a constitution. Now, Massachusetts delays that process, fortunately, I think, because they learned some lessons from the failures of the others. And John, in 1780, comes back from England for a brief moment or from France, actually, to draw up the Constitution for this state. So he's a constitutionalist, and I think that's how he should be remembered. He doesn't take a big stand against slavery. He's not a slaveholder. He doesn't like slavery. He wants no part of it. But in his correspondence with Jefferson, they avoid the subject because he knows it's a touchy business, and he doesn't want to offend Jefferson. But I think as he understood the nature of power, and he wanted to protect against it in any way he could. And so I think that's kind of the message I would hope you, if you're going to talk about his constitutional, just as a human being, he's a great human being. There's nobody better. As everyone who got to know him well said, this man, you just can't help loving him. I think it's part of his openness, his frankness, the way he would expose himself, his vulnerability. He just was extraordinary in his own way, very much different from Jefferson. Jefferson came to love him. And you can see why, because Jefferson is an uptight guy, reveals nothing about himself. Very uptight and reserved, but smart. and knows more about more things than any single person, even more than Franklin. But he's not giving of himself. When you're around him, I'm sure you always felt, oh my God, you're in awe of this guy, but you didn't really get to know him the way you would get Adams. And I think some of that could be revealed. The family is interesting. I mean, especially Louisa Catherine. Is she part of the...
Oh, yes, absolutely. First foreign first lady.
This is John Quincy's wife, who's an extraordinary woman in her own right. In many respects, more extraordinary than Abigail in some ways. She had a tougher life.
Much.
I think. At any rate, it's a great family, and I think it's a great idea because John has certainly been neglected. Second president of the United States, and he's
No
got
monument.
no monument in Washington at all. And the house is nice, but it's run by the Park Service. It's closed probably in the winter. I mean, that's just not fair.
Yeah, it's not fair. Well, this has been delightful. I appreciate you both so much. You know, ladies and gentlemen, you just heard it from one of the greatest living historians of our national narrative, and I'll tell you, there are damn few dead ones who've said it any better. So, thank you both very much for being here. Frederica Bear, Gordon Gill.
Thank you.
Take a bow.